I have kept the graven mark for 41 years, and for 40 of them I believed I would die without ever seeing the day it was built for. That is not a complaint. It is the truth of the work, and the work is honest about it. A keeper of the great coastal bastion is told from the first morning that she may spend her whole life maintaining a machine that never fires, tending an inscription that never proves true, drilling a watch against an enemy that the rest of the world has long since filed under myth. My grandmother kept the graven mark before me. Her mother kept it before her. None of them saw the wake guard wake. I used to think that was a mercy denied them. I have learned since that it was a mercy granted. Let me set down what happened in the order it happened, while my hands are still steady enough to set down anything at all. The records will keep the facts. The records are very good at facts, but the records cannot carry the weight of the hours, and somebody who was there ought to. The graven mark runs 11 kilometers along the western coast, a single continuous wall of dark composite and graven stone rising 600 meters out of the surf. Its seaward face inscribed top to bottom with the long inscription, the 500,000-year record of what was done to us, and what we resolved to do about it. People came from the inland megacities once a season to walk the gallery roads along its crown and read the oldest lines, the ones cut by hands that had watched the sky burn. Most of them treated it as a monument. I never blamed them. For 500,000 years it had been a monument. A monument is what a weapon looks like when it has not yet been needed. I grew up in the keeper towns at the foot of the wall, where every family did some part of the work and every child learned to read the inscription before they learned to read anything else. We were not like the inland cities. The cities had moved on, the way the living always move on from the dead, and that is no sin. A people cannot spend 500,000 years frightened. The inland had built a civilization that reached the planets, that hung warships in its own sky, that had nearly forgotten the wall existed except as a thing you visited once and felt solemn about. We had not moved on. We could not. Somebody has to be the part of the body that does not forget the wound, and that part is rarely thanked for it. I will tell you the truth about how the watch felt from the inside, because no one writes it down and somebody should. It felt foolish. 40 years I drilled crews against an enemy the rest of the species treated as a campfire story. 40 years I signed corrosion reports and tuned emitters and walked the night galleries listening to a sea that never brought anything but weather, and there were nights. I will admit it now. There is no shame left to protect. When I stood on the crown and looked up at the cold orbit, where the histories said the dormancy fleet drifted, and felt nothing out there at all, and wondered whether I had given my one life to a wall against the dark for nothing. My grandmother told me she had felt the same. Her mother had told her, it is part of the inheritance, that doubt. They pass it down with the keys. I think now it is the most important thing they pass down, because a faith that has never doubted is a thin and brittle thing, and the wall needed people whose faith had been tested in the long boredom and held anyway. Underneath the inscription, beneath the surf line, anchored into the bedrock that the old enemy itself had chosen, sat the thing the graven mark was actually built around. We called it the anchor. The Koval, when they laid it, had called it the seal of Seath, and they had meant it as a lid. I will come to that. It matters more than anything else in this account, and I want to lay the ground for it honestly, because the whole story turns on it, and because I am tired of hearing it told as if we got lucky. We did not get lucky. I want that written plainly on the first page in my own words. Luck had nothing to do with it. We were ready. We had been ready for a span of time the human mind cannot hold, and the readiness was not a single clever stroke or a hidden genius or a last-second miracle. It was 500,000 years of people getting up in the morning and doing the unglamorous work, and not stopping and not forgetting, and teaching their children to do the same. That is the whole secret. There is no other one. The first sign came on a gray morning in the late season, the kind where the haze sits low on the water and the orbital arrays are only smears of light overhead. I was on the crown gallery at the third watch station, going over a corrosion report I had read 40 times, when the deep listening floor under the anchor sent up its tone. I had heard that tone exactly once before in a drill, when I was 19 and certain it would never sound for real. Hearing it for real is nothing like the drill. The drill is a sound. This was a pressure, a change in the building under my boots, as though the graven mark itself had drawn a breath it had been holding since before there were words. The dormancy fleet was stirring. I want to explain what that meant because the people who wrote the histories afterward got the feeling of it wrong, every one of them. They wrote it as an alarm, a shock, a bolt out of a clear sky. It was the opposite of a shock. It was a thing we had described in precise detail for 5,000 centuries finally agreeing to occur. When I put my hand flat on the cold rail and felt the tone come up through it, the first thing I felt was not fear. It was a strange, terrible relief. They were real. They had always been real, and we had not wasted the watch. Then the discipline took over, because that is what the discipline is for, and I called the bastion to its stations and went to my own. The Koval do not travel as we travel. We learned this slowly, by reading what they left behind, and we built half of everything we built on the strength of having read it correctly. They do not cross the dark awake. They seal a world, lay the anchor of Seath into its bones, and then they sleep, not in the small way an animal sleeps, but in a way that swallows ages, their great vessels drifting cold and dreamless in the long orbit beyond the outer worlds, their crews folded down into something below life, waiting on the slow clock of the anchor to tell them the world below had ripened. That was their method everywhere, on every world they took. They did not conquer and hold. Holding is expensive, and the Koval are patient past the point any creature with a normal span of years can imagine. They conquered and lit it. They pressed the seal of Seath onto a living world to keep it from growing, to keep it small and frightened and useful, and then they went asleep above it and let the centuries do the keeping for them. When the clock tolled, they woke, came down, and harvested whatever the lidded world had become, its labor, its bodies, its bent and stunted strength. And then they sealed it again, and slept again, and so on down the corridor of time for as long as the world could bear it. I want to be careful here not to make them into devils, because they were not devils, and to call them devils is to misunderstand them in a way that would have gotten us killed. The Koval did not lid worlds out of cruelty. Cruelty requires that you imagine the other thing suffering, and the Koval did not imagine us at all. To a creature that sleeps through ages, a span that contains the whole rise and fall of a human civilization is a single afternoon's drowse. They did not see a lidded world as a prison full of suffering generations. They saw a field left fallow between harvests. We learned this from the seal's own logic, from the way it counted and pressed, and learning it was the hardest thing the early readers had to do, because to read an enemy truly, you must first stop hating him long enough to think like him, and the early readers had every reason in the world to hate. Their bodies matched their method. The Koval are long-lived past any reckoning, and between their wakings they fold down into a state that is not death and not sleep, a bank-coal stillness their physicians spent the whole long campaign perfecting, so that a Koval can lie cold in a dreamless vessel for 100,000 years, and rise again with the same thought half-finished in its head that it folded down on. They do not pass the work to children the way we do. There are no generations of Koval keeping a Koval watch. There is only the same crew, the same commander, the same Archon, waking and harvesting and sleeping, the same hands on the same work down the whole length of time. That is their great strength, and it was, in the end, the flaw we drove the wedge into. A people who never hand the work to a successor never have to teach the work to anyone. They never have to write it down. They never have to make a record a stranger could one day read. The Koval did not inscribe their seal because the Koval who built it expected to be the Koval who came back to it. They had no inscription. They had no graven mark. They had only their own unbroken memory, and they had never once imagined that the thing they lidded might do the keeping better than they did. Above the fleet, above the wake guard, above even the wakeful prime, sat the Archon's mind. I have called it a mind, and that is the nearest word, but it is not a mind as a man has a mind. It is the sovereign of the whole long campaign, a sleeping intelligence vast enough to hold the accounts of 1,000 harvested worlds at once, woken only when a harvest is confirmed ripe and ready to be taken in full. The wakeful are sent down first, the scouts of the sleepers, to stand on the surface and confirm with their own wide low eyes that the seal has held and the field is ready. Only then is the Archon roused, and only the Archon can command the harvest. That structure, too, we read out of the seal long before we met it in the flesh. And that structure, too, was a thing we built our whole plan around, because a fleet that cannot act until its sovereign wakes is a fleet you defeat by making sure the sovereign never wakes at all. They had done it to us. 500,000 years ago, when humanity had just begun to reach past its own atmosphere and was proud of it in the way a child is proud of standing, the Koval came and the sky burned, and the world we had nearly killed ourselves to build was thrown down. We have a name for that season. We call it Earth's End, and the name is not poetry. It very nearly was the end. The anchor went into the western bedrock, and the seal of Seath pressed down on what was left of us, and the Koval looked at the ruin they had made, judged it sufficient, and went up into the dark to sleep. They expected to wake to a husk, a frightened, lidded, diminished thing, grown just enough to be worth the harvesting, kept small by the seal exactly as 10,000 other worlds had been kept small before us. What they did not understand, what their whole method depended on not understanding, was that they had left their ledgers behind, not on paper, in the seal itself. The anchor of Seath was a working machine, and a working machine can be read by anyone stubborn enough to spend 100 generations reading it. They believed the seal was a lid no hand beneath it could lift. They were not entirely wrong. We never did lift it. We did something they had not budgeted for, because in all their long career of lidding worlds, no lidded world had ever done it. We studied the lock. I will not pretend I understand the deep mathematics of it. I'm an engineer of structure and stress, of composite and corrosion and load, not of the seal's strange interior. But I have spent my life inside the building raised around the seal's reading, and I have walked the galleries where the work was done, and I can tell you the shape of it. The first survivors, the ones who watched the sky burn and lived, did not curse the anchor and try to break it. They could not have broken it. Instead, they sat down beside it in the rubble of the world and began to write down what it did, how it pressed, how it listened, how it counted, what signal it would one day send up into the dark to call its makers home, and what signal, in turn, it would expect to hear back. They wrote it on the bedrock, because paper rots and people die. They cut it into the stone, and when they had filled the stone, they raised more stone and cut into that, and the cutting became the long inscription, and the inscription became the graven mark, and the keeping of the graven mark became a vocation that passed from hand to hand across a span of time long enough to raise mountains. Civilizations rose and fell on the inland plains in that span. The continents shifted their shoulders. The ice came and went and came again. And through all of it, in an unbroken chain, somebody read the seal, corrected the record, and taught the next reader to read. That is the part the histories cannot make people feel. 500,000 years, not a heroic age, not one bright generation that saved us. 500,000 years of ordinary people, most of them tired, most of them doubted by their neighbors, keeping a promise to a sky that had not changed and might never change. The discipline of it is the most human thing we have ever done, and it is the reason I am able to write this down on a free world. By the time I was born, the work was finished and had been finished for ages, though no one would say it aloud. We knew what signal the anchor would send when the clock tolled. We knew what the wake guard would expect to find. And we had spent the latter half of the long wait not merely reading the seal, but learning to speak its language back to it, to make the anchor say, to the fleet waking above us, precisely what the fleet expected a lidded world to make it say. When the tone came up through the rail under my hand that gray morning, the anchor was already lying. It had begun lying the instant the dormancy fleet stirred, exactly as we had taught it. It was telling the Koval that the seal of Seath held firm, that the world beneath was small and frightened and ripe, that nothing had changed in 500,000 years but the depth of our submission. Everything the Wake Guard believed as they came down to us, they believed because we had decided, long before any of them were born this time, that they should believe it. The descent took 2 days. I spent both of them on the crown of the graven mark, and I will not soon forget the strangeness of those 2 days, the strangeness of standing inside a finished trap, watching the quarry walk toward it across the floor of the sky, and being able to do nothing to hurry it and nothing to wave it off. My second on the crown those 2 days was a keeper named Aldous Wren, a man near my own age who had come up through the emitter cruise and knew the seaward face better than any of us, every coupling and every weld of the 11 kilometers of weapon that wore the inscription like a skin. We had worked the wall together for 30 years and quarreled the whole time, the easy quarrel of 2 people who trust each other completely and would rather die than say so. On the first night of the descent, with the great vessel still a cold point falling through the dark above the outer air, he stood beside me at the rail and neither of us spoke for a long while. And then he said the thing we were both thinking, which was that our grandmothers should have been there to see it, and that it was a hard kind of unfairness, that the ones who carried the worst of the weight would never know the watch had not been wasted. I told him that the weight was the watch, that there was no part of it that was waste, that the boredom and the doubt were not the price of the readiness but the substance of it. He said I sounded like the inscription. I told him the inscription was right more often than he was, and he laughed, the only laugh I heard in those 2 days, and we went back to watching the sky. I tell that small thing because the histories make the descent sound like a held breath and nothing else, and it was not nothing else. It was 2 days of ordinary people doing extraordinary work without raising their voices. The emitter crews ran their checks and ran them again, not because the wall needed it, but because the hands needed it, because a frightened hand wants a task, and the discipline gives it one. The orbital arrays handed the track between them as the world turned, smooth as breathing. The home fleet, the kilometers-long warships hanging over the inland cities, brought their crews to stations and held there, and held and held, the hardest order a warship ever receives, which is to be ready and not to fire. Out across the whole face of super-strong Earth, in the megacities that climbed kilometers into the air on the inland plains, in the lunar yards and the forward posts strung out to the edge of the system, a species that had spent 500,000 years preparing for a single afternoon brought itself quietly to readiness and made no noise about it. There were no speeches. There was no panic. There was only the watch at last awake, doing the thing it had been built to do, which was mostly to wait a little longer and not flinch. And the anchor beneath the surf beneath my boots went on lying. I went down to the deep listening floor once on the second day, alone, because a keeper should stand once beside the thing the whole wall is built around. It is a cold place and a strange one, the bedrock the Koval themselves chose. And at its center the anchor sat in its housing and counted, as it had counted for 500,000 years, and the tone it sent up into the dark was the tone of a sealed and frightened world, smooth and steady and entirely false. I put my hand on the housing. It was the same housing my grandmother had put her hand on, and her mother before her, and the first survivors before any of them in the ash. I do not pray. The keepers are not a praying people. We put our faith in the work, not above it. But I stood there with my hand on the lie we had spent 500,000 years learning to tell, and I felt the whole chain of hands that had stood there before me, and that was near enough to prayer for any purpose I have ever needed it. We tracked them from the moment the first vessel broke from the cold orbit. The orbital arrays had them cold, the deep listening floor had them. The warships of the home fleet, kilometers long, hanging in the high air over the inland cities like a second range of mountains, had them and held their fire and waited, because the waiting was the plan, and the plan was older than the warships. The Koval did not see the warships at first. That was deliberate too. We had spent generations learning the angles from which a waking fleet would look at Earth, and we had arranged the things they must not see to sit, for those first crucial hours, behind the curve of the world. What they saw was the western coast, and the graven mark on it, and the graven mark was the only thing on the whole face of the planet we wanted them to see. I was at the third watch station again when the first vessel came down low enough to read with the naked eye, and I climbed to the rail to read it that way, because a keeper should look at the thing with her own eyes at least once before the instruments take over and turn it into numbers. It came in slow over the water, vast and slab-sided, the color of old iron stained by long cold, its hull scarred not by battle, but by the simple abrasion of 500,000 years adrift. There is a particular look to a thing that has slept too long. I had seen it on the oldest faces of the inscription, the cut lines softened by weather. The vessel had that look. It was a relic of itself. It came in expecting nothing. I want to be precise about that because it is the whole of the matter. It did not come in cautious. It did not come in ready for a fight. It came in the way you walk into a storeroom you locked yourself, a long time ago, certain of what you will find. It did not even bother with a high pass to survey the world it had returned to claim. Why would it? The anchor had told it the seal held. A sealed world does not surprise its keeper. It simply waits to be opened. It set down on the broad shelf of reclaimed land south of the bastion, where we had left the ground open and unbuilt for this exact arrival, and where the soil, if any of their instruments had thought to test it, would have told them it had been graded and compacted by machines they had no name for. The vessel's belly opened, and the ramp came down, and the wakeguard of Seath walked out onto the earth their ancestors had broken, to harvest a world that was watching them from 11 kilometers of inscribed stone and did not blink. I saw them through the long glass. I will describe them because the descriptions in the records are too clean. The Koval are tall, taller than a man by half again, and they move on 2 legs but wrongly, with a forward hinge to the knee that makes their walk look like a thing perpetually beginning to fall and catching itself. Their armor was heavy, layered plate the same stained iron color as their ship, fitted close over a body that is narrower than ours through the chest and broader through the shoulder, so that a Koval in armor reads as a wedge, a thing built to drive forward and not be turned. Their heads are long, the eyes set wide and low and dark, with a second pair of lidded pits above them that we believe sense heat. When the light caught those eyes there was no white in them, no soft part, nothing a man could read for feeling. And yet before that day was out, I read feeling in them clearly enough. So can anyone, once the body learns it is going to die. Their commander walked at the center, and I knew him for the commander before any insignia confirmed it, by the way the others bent their walk around his. We learned his rank later from the surrender record, Wakeful Prime, the first of the sleepers to rise, the one tasked with confirming the harvest before the Archon's own great mind was woken to oversee it. We learned his name too, Othin. I set it down because he behaved, at the end, in a way that earned having his name remembered, and there have been few enough of the Koval who did. For the first hour, Othin and his wakeguard simply stood on the shelf and looked at us, and did nothing, and I understood that they were waiting for the world to do what lidded worlds do, to send out the trembling delegation, to bring the tribute and the bent knee, to behave like a thing that had been small and frightened for 500,000 years. We did not move. The graven mark did not move. The warships in the high air over the inland cities did not move. The orbital arrays crossed and recrossed the pale sky and did not move. 11 kilometers of inscribed stone stood over the Koval and said nothing, and the silence went on long past the point where a lidded world would have broken it, and I watched through the long glass as the first thing changed in the Wakeful Prime's posture. He looked up. It is a small thing to write. A creature lifted its head, but I had been told by keepers who had it from keepers that this was the moment everything turned on, and they were right. For the whole of his waking he had looked level at the ground, at the shelf, at the husk he expected to harvest. Now, for the first time, Othin of the Koval lifted his long head and looked up at the graven mark, really looked. The way you look at a thing when some animal part of you has begun to suspect it is larger than you assumed. and I watched the suspicion travel up the 11 kilometers of inscribed stone, level by level, until it reached the crown where I stood, and then past the crown up into the high air, where the curve of the world had begun to release the things we had hidden behind it. The warships came into his sight slowly. The world turned, and the inland fleet rose over the horizon of his understanding the way the sun rises, not all at once but as a growing impossibility along the rim of everything he knew. One ship, then the shapes of others behind it. Then the realization, I saw the realization, I will swear to it on the inscription itself, that the dark shapes were not clouds and not mountains, that the scale his eye was refusing was the true scale, that each of those things hanging quiet in the air over the distant cities was longer than the vessel that had carried his whole wakeguard across 500,000 years of dark. I have wondered since what the whole of it must have looked like through those wide, low eyes, what a creature sees when the field it came to harvest stands up around it and is revealed to be a power. He would have seen, beyond the warships, the inland cities themselves, climbing in tiers of light kilometers into the air, more city than the Koval in all their long campaign had ever built or broken, raised by a species they had thrown into the ash and judged finished. He would have seen the orbital arrays stitching the daylight sky, ring on ring of them, the defense grid of a world that had spent 500,000 years deciding it would never again be caught looking down. He would have seen, if his instruments turned at last to the things beneath his feet, that the shelf he stood on was graded, that the soil was worked, that the very ground of his arrival had been prepared for him by hands he had not believed could still hold a tool. And he would have understood, all at once and far too late, that there was no part of this world that had not been waiting for him, that the silence was not submission, and the stillness was not fear, that he had walked his whole wakeguard down a ramp into the open mouth of a thing that had read his lock and built its house upon it. The Koval method had never once failed before us. I want that held in mind because it is the measure of what the discovery cost him. 10,000 worlds, the seal's accounting said, 10,000 fields lidded and harvested and lidded again, and not one of them had ever grown instead of shrunk, not one had ever read the lock, not one had ever stood up. The wakeful prime had woken into the certainty of 10,000 successes, and in the space of a single turning of the world that certainty came apart in his hands, and there is no soldier alive, of any species, who can take that blow standing easy. He had not come back to a husk, he had come back to a power, and the anchor that had told him otherwise, the lock he had trusted for 500,000 years, the seal of Seath that no lidded world had ever read, had been lying to him in his own tongue since the moment he stirred. And then, because he was a soldier and not a fool, he understood the rest of it in a single fall, the way a man who has stepped off a roof understands the ground. The arrays in the sky, the unbroken stone, the silence that had not broken because it was not afraid, the shelf of graded land his ancestors had never graded, the world that had not sent out a trembling delegation because the world had no intention of trembling, all of it in one drop all the way down. I have tried in the years since to find the human words for what crossed the wakeful prime's face in that moment, and I have never found them, because the words we have were made for human faces. The nearest I can come is this. I have seen a man, once, learn that a thing he had spent his life building was founded on a measurement that was wrong, and that everything raised on it would have to come down. It was that. It was the face of a creature learning that the ground of its certainty had never been ground at all. We should not have come back. I could not hear him say it across that distance, and the Koval do not speak in any register a human ear can catch unaided, but I did not need to hear it. It was written on him as plainly as the inscription was written on the stone behind me, and every keeper on the crown read it at the same instant, and a sound went down the gallery that I have never heard before or since. Not a cheer. The discipline does not allow a cheer, but a long, low exhalation, 11 kilometers of people letting go of a breath their ancestors had begun to hold 500,000 years before. What happened next was the only part of the day that went wrong, and it cost us, and I will not soften it. The Wakeguard did not surrender at the sight of us. I think now that I expected them to, in some childish corner of myself, as though seeing the truth would be enough. It was not enough. The Koval are not built to bend at a glance, and Othin was the first of the sleepers to wake, which means he was the one least able to accept that the campaign was already lost. For if it was lost, then he had woken the harvest into a grave, and no commander wants that on his record before the Archon's mind has even risen. So he did what a cornered soldier does. He tried to make the world smaller again by force. There was an order. I did not hear it, but I saw its result. A weapon mounted on the shelf side of the great vessel, an old weapon, a relic like the ship, but a relic that had broken worlds, woke and fired, not at the graven mark, which it had perhaps already judged too large, but at the forward listening station on the headland 3 kilometers north, where a watch crew held the post that read the anchors near field. I saw it strike. I want to set down what it is to watch, through a long glass on a gray morning, a weapon older than your whole civilization reach out and take a place you know. There was no sound at first, across that distance. The light came before the sound, a hard white flowering on the headland where the station had stood, and then the ground shock rolled across the water and up the face of the wall and arrived under my boots a long moment later, as though the world itself were slow to believe it. When the light cleared, there was no headland. There was a wound in the coast where the headland had been, and a column of dust standing over it, leaning slowly inland on the morning wind. I knew them. That is the part I carry. I knew the woman who held that post, a keeper named Saurais Vane who had trained 2 seasons under me and argued with me about corrosion tolerances until I wanted to throw her off the crown, and who was right more often than I ever admitted to her face. She had a laugh that carried the length of a gallery, and a way of standing with her arms crossed when she had decided you were wrong and was waiting for you to catch up. I knew her crew. I had drilled most of them. I had signed the orders that posted them to the headland, because the headland needed its steadiest hands and they were the steadiest I had, and that is a thing a keeper learns to live with and never learns to forgive. The headland is gone now. We left the crater. We cut their names into the lowest course of new stone the next season, every one, and we did not cut a count beside the names, because a count is a thing you do to strangers and these were ours. They held the near-field watch until the moment it ended, and the reading they sent up in their last seconds told the bastion the anchor was secure, which is to say they did their work to the end, which is the only eulogy a keeper would want. I will not dress it further. They died because a frightened thing lashed out, and they died doing the work, and the work held. The temptation, writing this, is to make their deaths the hinge of the day, the price that bought the victory, the thing that gave the rest of it meaning. I have read enough histories to know the shape that wants to take. I will not give it that shape because it would be a lie, and Saurais Vane hated a lie worse than she hated a bad weld. Their deaths bought nothing. The victory was already bought, paid for across 500,000 years before any of them were born. They did not die to win the war. They died at the end of a war already won, killed by an enemy too proud to read the wall in front of him, and there is no meaning to be wrung from that, only grief and the names in the stone, and the work going on. After the headland, the discipline that had kept us silent became the discipline that let us answer, and the answer was not a slaughter, though it could have been. I want that understood. We could have ended the Wakeguard in the time it takes to write this paragraph. The warships in the high air had firing solutions on the great vessel before its weapon had finished cooling. The orbital arrays could have reached down and unmade the shelf and everything on it. The Gravenmark itself, the old monument the inland tourists walked across, was never a monument. It was the largest directed energy installation the species has ever built, and its seaward face, the one that wore the inscription, was the emitter. 11 kilometers of weapon had a single target standing on a shelf in the open, and the target had just killed our headland crew. We did not fire it. The order not to fire came down from the home fleet, but it did not need to. It was already written. It is written, in fact, on the graven mark in the oldest course of the inscription, in the lines the first survivors cut while the sky was still raining ash, and I had read those lines 1,000 times and never understood them until that afternoon. They are not a curse on the Koval. The first survivors, the ones with the most reason of any of us to want the enemy unmade, did not cut a curse. They cut an oath. They wrote that we would remember what was done to us, and that we would prepare, and that we would be ready, and that when the day came and the power was ours, we would not become the thing that had broken us. We would not seal a living world. We would not lid the helpless and sleep above them and call it patience. We would do the harder thing. We would hold our strength in our hand and not close the fist. 500,000 years is long enough to forget an oath. We did not forget it. That, more than the weapon, more than the warships, more than the long reading of the seal, is the thing I am proudest of, and it is the thing the histories get most wrong, because a battle is easy to write and a restraint is not. So instead of firing, we closed the lock. This is the part the deep mathematics governs, and I will give it to you in the engineer's shape rather than the theorist's. The anchor of Seath was a lock built to hold a world down. The Koval had built it to work in one direction only, to press, to lid, to keep the small things small. They had never imagined it might be made to work the other way, because to imagine that they would have had to imagine a lidded world that had read the lock, and no lidded world ever had. We had spent the last 200,000 years not merely reading the seal but quietly rebuilding its near field, course by course, generation by generation, so that the same mechanism the Koval trusted to hold us down could be made, on a signal we held, and they did not, to reach up instead of down, and clamp. I worked on the near field myself in my younger years, before I rose to the crown. It is patient, exacting work, the work of fitting a new course of the lock against the old without the old ever knowing it has been touched. Because the anchor listens to itself as much as it listens to the dark, and a clumsy hand would have woken its suspicion across the centuries and ruined everything our grandmothers built. We worked in the cold under the surf, by the light of the deep floor, fitting our courses the way the first survivors fitted theirs, knowing as they knew that we would never see the work used, that we were cutting a key for a door we would not be alive to open. That is the truest face of the readiness. It is not the day the weapon fires. It is the 10,000 days no one will ever cheer, the hands in the cold fitting one more course against a day past the edge of their own lives, trusting that the chain will not break after them. We did not break it. That is the whole of what I am proud of. When Othin's weapon fired on the headland, the signal went. I felt it go. The whole graven mark felt it, a single deep concussion in the bedrock, not a shot but a closing, the sound a door of a size no human ever built makes when it is shut. It came up through the rail and through my boots and through the teeth in my head, and for one moment the whole 11 kilometers of stone seemed to lean seaward, the way a man leans into a long-awaited effort, and then it settled and it was done. Out beyond the orbit of the moon, where the rest of the dormancy fleet still drifted cold, waiting for the wakeful prime's confirmation to rouse the Archon's great mind and bring the harvest down in full, the seal of Seath reached up through 500,000 years of its own patient counting and took hold of its makers. The cold vessels could not wake. The folded crews could not rise. The Archon's mind, the vast sleeping sovereign that was the whole purpose of the fleet and the source of every order it would ever give, lay pinned in its long dream by the very lock it had built to pin us, and could not be woken and would not be woken on any clock but ours. I have thought often about what that must be, for a creature that experiences ages as afternoons, to lie down certain of waking to a ripe harvest, and to find in the next breath of its slow time that the breath will not come, that the dream has no morning, that the world it lidded has reached up through the years and held the lid shut from the other side. We did not kill the Archon. We did something the Koval had never once done to any world they took. We left it alive and aware and held. I do not know which of those is the mercy and which is the sentence. I am not sure the Koval know either. Othin stood on the shelf with his wake guard around him, and felt his fleet go silent above him, felt the confirmation he was waiting to send become a thing he could no longer send, felt the harvest he had woken to command become a tomb he had woken into. The relic weapon that had killed our headland crew did not fire again. There was nothing left to fire it for. I watched him through the long glass as the truth settled into him in its final weight. He did not rage. I had half expected rage, and there was none. He turned his long head and looked along the 11 kilometers of the graven mark slowly, from the southern terminus to the northern, and I understood that he was reading it, that whatever sense the cove will have for their own works was telling him, plainly, that the stone he was looking at was the seal of Seath grown into a fortress. His lock made our wall. His patience turned and aimed back down the long corridor of time into his own sleeping heart. He looked at the inscription he could not read and knew, the way you know a thing in the body before the mind agrees, that every line of it was about him. Then he set his weapon down on the shelf, and his wake guard set theirs down beside it, and the wakeful prime of the Koval lowered himself onto the graded earth in the posture we would later learn was their deepest one, the one a Koval takes before a power it has judged greater than itself and cannot fight. He had come to harvest a husk. He surrendered to a wall. The taking of the surrender fell to the home fleet and the diplomats, and I had no part in it, and I am glad I had no part in it, because I do not think I could have kept the oath in my own chest that day with the headland crater still smoking 3 kilometers north of me. The oath is easier to keep when it is written on stone older than your grief. I have thought about that a great deal since. The first survivors did not write the oath because they were calm. They wrote it because they were not, and they knew their descendants would not be either, and they wanted the calm thing already cut into the rock for the day none of us would be able to find it in ourselves. They were keeping faith with us across 500,000 years, the same way we were keeping faith with them. The graven mark is a chain that runs both directions in time. I did not understand that until I stood on it. The diplomats came west the next morning, and I watched some of the meeting from the crown, through the long glass, because a keeper is permitted that much. They did not gloat. I had feared they might. We are a people, and a people that has just won the longest war in its history has gloating in it somewhere. But the men and women who walked out onto the shelf to take the wakeful prime's surrender walked the way you walk into a sick room, quiet and unhurried, carrying nothing in their hands. They understood, as I came to understand, that there is no triumph to be had over a thing that has just learned its whole long life was built on a measurement that was wrong. There is only the work of what comes after, and they began it. The terms were these, and they were not soft, and they were not cruel. The wake guard would not be unmade. The dormancy fleet would not be unmade, though it could not have resisted, pinned as it was. The Archon's great mind would be wakened, on our clock in our presence, with the seal still closed around it like a hand around a coal, and made to understand what it had returned to, and made to carry that understanding back up the long corridor to whatever council of sleepers had sent it. We did not want the Koval dead. We wanted the Koval to know. A species that lids worlds and sleeps above them does it because it has never once been made to stand on the surface and look up. We made them look up. We are, I think, the only world that ever has. There was a cost to that choice, and the diplomats counted it openly, which is the only way to count a cost honestly. To leave the Koval alive and knowing is to leave word loose in the dark that one world, at least, read the lock and turned it. The Koval did not lid us alone. The seal of Seath lies over worlds we will never see, worlds still small and frightened and waiting on a harvest that may now never come, because the fleet that would have brought it lies pinned beyond our moon. Some of our own argued in the long councils after that we should have unmade the Koval utterly and kept the secret of the reading buried, lest the rest of their kind learn it can be done and change their method against the next world they take. It is not a foolish argument. I have lost sleep over it. But the oath does not bend to prudence, and the keepers stood with the oath, and the councils came round to it in the end. We would not buy our safety with another world's silence. We had been the silenced world once. We remembered what it cost, and we remembered what we swore, and we did not become them. If the reading travels, let it travel. Let every lidded world the Koval ever made here that the lock can be turned. That is not a danger we created. That is a debt we are paying forward, into a dark we will not live to see, the same way our debt was paid forward to us. They left under escort, what was left of them, the great relic vessel rising slow off the shelf with the wakeful prime aboard, and the warships in the high air parted to let it climb and closed again behind it, and the orbital arrays tracked it out to the dark without a shot. The dormancy fleet we kept. It drifts now beyond the moon, cold and pinned, the Archon's mind dreaming inside it on a leash we hold, and there is a watch on it, a new watch, the first new watch the species has had to invent in 500,000 years. That is a strange thing to be alive for, the founding of a watch. The Gravenmark's watch was so old its beginning was a thing we read about, not a thing anyone remembered choosing. Now there are men and women being trained to keep an eye on a pinned fleet beyond the moon the way my grandmother was trained to keep an eye on a sealed point in the cold orbit, and their grandchildren will keep it after them, and their grandchildren after that, and most of them will spend their whole lives at it and feel, on the long nights, exactly the foolishness I felt, that they have given their one life to a wall against the dark for nothing. That the thing out there is only a story, that the world has moved on and left them holding a key to a door no one believes in, and they will keep it anyway. That is the inheritance. We have made another one. I do not know whether to be glad of that or sorry, and I have decided in my old age that it is not for me to feel either way about it. It simply is the work, and the work goes on. I am too old to keep that new watch. My granddaughter may. The work always goes on. That is the only thing I am truly sure of. I went down to the headland the next morning, before the diplomats and the recorders and the inland crowds came west to look at the place where the Koval surrendered. I went alone, in the gray light, and I stood at the edge of the crater where Saurai's vein had argued with me about corrosion tolerances, and I did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the stone would not say better when we cut the names. The sea came in and went out. The Gravenmark stood at my back, 11 kilometers of kept promise, and the morning haze burned off the water the way it does, and somewhere out past the moon a sovereign mind that had broken the world dreamed in a lock of our making, and could not wake. People ask me, now that they know my name, whether it was worth it. They mean the 40 years, the lives that built the Gravenmark, the headland crew, the 500,000 years of ordinary tired people getting up to do the unglamorous work for a day they would never see. They ask it gently, the way you ask a thing you have already decided the answer to, and they expect me to say yes, of course, and weep, and they can go home satisfied. I do not say yes, of course. I say the truer thing, which is that worth was never the question, and the people who kept the watch knew it was never the question. You do not keep a 500,000-year promise because it will be worth it. You keep it because it was made, and because the ones who made it had more reason than you ever will to break it and did not. You keep it because somewhere down the long corridor, a tired keeper you will never meet is counting on you the way you are counting on the ones who came before. And the chain does not care whether any single link finds it worth the carrying. We were ready, not lucky, not clever, ready in the way that only a people who refuse to forget can be ready, across a span of time that should have ground the memory to nothing and did not. The Koval slept above us for 500,000 years and trusted the dark to do their keeping. We stayed awake and did our own. I have kept the Gravenmark for 41 years. I will not keep it much longer, but I have seen the day it was built for, and I have seen the enemy lower his weapon onto the earth his ancestors broke, and I have watched 11 kilometers of my people exhale a breath that was first drawn before the ice came and went and came again. Whatever comes after me, that breath is let. The watch held, the oath held. And the stone, which the tourists once mistook for a monument, will go on saying what it has always said, in lines too old for the enemy to read and too plain for us ever to forget. We remembered, we prepared, we did not become them. Let the next keeper add a line beneath it when her own day comes. There is room. We left room. We always leave room. That is how it happened in the order it happened. The records will keep the facts. I have kept the rest.